What's up, everybody? This is George C.O.C. Samuels, Managing Director for FIA, and we're just going to dive into part two of how social networks may be impacted by Bitcoin in the future. And this is probably a good time because I was having a chat with a fellow Bitcoiner on Twitter, and we were talking about how Bitcoin is now both of us actually have a lot of interest in social networks, communities, etc. And we were talking about how there's a lot from the past that is really important to learn from. And with a lot of Craig Wright's content that he's put out, he's shown how Bitcoin is inspired by a lot of things from the past, especially when it comes to nature and history. So many different areas. That's what makes Bitcoin so fascinating. And so we were talking specifically about kinships, and in indigenous cultures, how a lot of their structures worked, and how a healthy society and even healthy individuals came from having a healthy support network or community, right? And these typically came in the form of relationships dealing with kinships. And now, if you look at what a kinship structure is, it says here, kinship refers to the way social, I don't see, this is a very long sentence, but I want to highlight it anyways. Kinship structure refers to the way social relationships between individuals related by blood, affinal ties, or socially defined connection are organized and normally regulated. Kinship structure is the central organizational principle of many traditional societies, since it is through the kinship structure that social placement, cultural transmission, and many functional necessities for life will be met. And now, of course, we looked at how and why communities are so important, or why they're becoming a lot more prominent in conversations, especially on Twitter and with a lot of the different Bitcoin communities. We are still very tribal. As much as we have tried to come up with different organizational structures, human beings tend to just band up in their tribes. Now, if I look back at, say, some other indigenous Polynesian social structures, this here is taken from the Polynesian side. Here is a structure for the Samoan culture. As you'll notice here, they look at it more as a triangle, and you've got the Council of Chiefs, the Matai. You've got the men, you've got the women, and then you've got the Ainga family. So family is a very important thing to the Samoans. Here is the Hawaiian structure, kinship ties, and you'll find that with a lot of more older cultures, indigenous cultures, they typically remember quite a lot of their kinship ties via families. The more closer you get to the current generation, we don't tend to remember these things as much unless an elder has put down the family tree in some form of written language. But before, it was all oral. And now, why this is important is because if you look at all these social ties, and then if you look at sort of folks like, in terms of systems like Uber and Airbnb. Now, once upon a time, right, we would trust people based on the family ties, the clan ties, etc. But now, and you wouldn't ever dare, engage with a stranger, unless you want to befriend them. But Uber, Airbnb, they've got these systems that essentially make it so that the new kinship comes through trust in the systems themselves. Okay, now this was the start through the sharing economy, right? So Uber, you get into the car of a stranger, but you're trusting that the system works enough that you can get in and not ever have to worry about anything happening to you because the system works itself, right? Airbnb, it all has to do with rating, and you're kind of looking at trust from reviews by others, right? That is what is giving you your trust. And then if you look at, Bitcoin itself, Bitcoin, what are we asking people to do? We're asking people to trust the system because it is decentralized, right? It's not meant to have anyone who can control, ideally, the protocol, right? And then people build on top of that, right? And that is what is supposed to be part of that trust. Sharing economy, you can see here, this, was a hot topic a while back. I think it still is, and I think we're still going through it. The sharing economy right here. This is essentially where it's about businesses who don't necessarily own a lot of physical assets, but they're the connectors, the glues themselves between. And they're tapping into a lot of this kinship stuff, actually. If you think about it, that comes from far back. And the reason why this is such an important topic, we think, is because, well, actually not too long. Well, this is 2012, but had written an article about the return of the ancestors. This is something I found out while working with indigenous communities, that there were a lot of prophecies about a time when people would seek out the old ways to sort of help them get a better sense of identity for themselves, but also to learn from the past and to solve some of today's and the future's problems with some of that wisdom. Because I think in getting tied up in the shiny and the new, we've forgotten the wisdom that has been passed down for maybe, centuries or even millennia. Right. So there's I think a famous quote or saying that the further you can see into the past, the further you can see into the future. And here it's just this is from Truth Brings Clarity. This is interesting, right? So even looking at this, Truth Brings Clarity. What is Bitcoin? Bitcoin is a truth machine, an immutable evidence store, right? So, if you have the eyes to see and you can make those connections, great. If not, it's still interesting to look at these connections between a lot of these different services. So Facebook, just on the topic of, say, open, wide social networks, at the beginning, Facebook was all about connecting the world, but now it's about bringing the world closer together, which relates to the concept of the small world network, which we've talked about in a previous video article. But if you can see here, small world network is a near complete graph. Regular being here, a complete graph, and it's incomplete. All right, small world network, also known, if you've ever experienced the small world effect, where you keep connecting with people in seemingly random places, but they still happen to be connected to you, or at least your friends, in a way that you feel like the world really is a small place, right? So yeah, Facebook changes its missions with announcements about groups. Essentially, they're looking to now create more intimate groups. Content that goes into groups are going to be prioritized higher in your Facebook feeds. So this is, an attempt to sort of come back to the fundamentals, the basics. And, it looks like kinship structures is what a lot of the indigenous groups eventually fell on in terms of systems that work for them at the time, because people want to feel like they're part of a family, like they belong. And I think some of our social issues of today are a result of a lack of that. And so all of these things are aspects which sort of give us fertile soil for Bitcoin to really grow. And also this is how you're going to see Bitcoin impact the way that we network with one another, communicate, connect in the world that is coming. And in video 1 of this series, we did look at sort of some examples of how some developers are already creating projects that take Bitcoin and allow you to start using it to be able to interact. And if you don't remember, this one here was one of those projects. We'll load, right? So kind of like a Reddit, where you can go and vote and interact with this, right? But you're going to be using Bitcoin for all of it. So yeah, it's not just about the payment, but it's actually the underlying, what you're seeing is all done on Bitcoin. So even this, you might not even realize this is all done using Bitcoin, like every aspect of it. All right. So there was the concept of a serverless website. I think that was Bottle. But yeah, essentially you could also have serverless websites. So everything's actually being built using Bitcoin itself. So yeah, these are just some of the things that are going into the shift that we're now seeing, and how social networks are going to be impacted or influenced by a lot of old concepts, actually, that just, together, they're allowing us to be able to do things like, scale to the type of global society that we have now. And so it's going to be very interesting over the next, 10, 20 years to see how this all takes shape, and, what sort of new applications or platforms we see as a result of a Bitcoin type of world.